Oh, that's the right slide. Okay, guys, welcome back to Module 3. So this section is on capturing your photos. We'll talk about equipment, we'll talk about lighting, we'll talk about composition. Let's get right into it. So choosing the right equipment, obviously you're going to need a camera, you're going to need a tripod, and you're going to need some lighting. Basically, you can use any sort of lighting, window light, artificial light, or just available light. Tripod, we'll go over what you can get on Amazon. Not very expensive, don't overthink it. We're going to be talking about cameras. We'll talk about your phones, and we'll talk about other options. Okay, so for camera selection, there are just some things that you'll need to consider. Obviously, these we're going to go over them in more detail as I have a lesson on the iPhone and how to use the different features. But your basic camera phone has most of these features built in. Low light performance, image stabilization, so that you can hand hold your camera, and also that it will track a subject while it's moving, so that it'll have better focus. You have RAW versus JPEG. I'll give you a more in-depth lesson in that as well. File size, megapixels. All cameras today are pretty much amazing for your web use. Typically for your web or for your phone, you're using an image no larger than 1500 pixels by 1500 pixels. So you don't really need anything larger than your phone camera, which are generally 12 megapixels at this point. Any phone since 2018 will have a camera that size. Cost, ease of use, of course. My tip there is the best camera is the one you already own and know how to use. So camera phones are amazing after 2018 and should all work fine for web and social media needs. Okay, so camera phones, if you can upgrade to one of the iPhone 13s or 14s or the latest Samsung or the latest Google Pixel phones, you should be just fine. Digital cameras, if you got them, you can use them. If you know how to use them, great. But they don't have as many of the new features as just comes built into your phone. All right, so quickly to go over the difference of file types. I'll show you how to turn this on and what to do with it in a separate video later. But right now we're talking about RAW versus JPEG. And there's some confusion, but I think this analogy will really nail it home. So RAW files you can consider just the ingredients for cooking. It's your digital negative. So if you remember, we used to shoot pictures onto a negative, a celluloid coated in silver that's reactive. And maybe I have that wrong. Don't quote me on that. Maybe I'll just edit that out. All right, so you have raw images, and you can think about them kind of like raw ingredients. And once you get it home, you're going to cook it. So meaning you're going to do some editing, you're going to do some cropping, you're going to do some exposure correction, you're going to do some image selection. So you're going to figure out what you want to use and how you want to cook it. And once you've cooked it and you've served it, that's an export. So you export a file or print in the old days, you print it out, or we export it as a JPEG. Now that's your cooked dish. Okay. And if you were to reheat that food or cook it twice, you end up overcooking it or overheating it. You might burn it. And if you were to take a JPEG that you've processed out and you're going to make further corrections to it, that's oftentimes when the image looks a little bit too cooked, a little bit too fried, let's say. Okay. So let's go over some basic lighting techniques. Um, I want to talk about physics of light. I want to talk about indoor lighting and exterior lighting, but mostly let's discuss briefly, the differences between these different types of light. All right. So here we have an illustration of direct versus indirect light, uh, and what it looks like on a subject, and the variety of ways light can scatter and create these different types of light. All right. So direct light obviously is when you have light that's pointed directly at the subject. If you have a source producing the light, either it's the sun or it's a light that you've brought, or it's an interior light. Um, if it's pointed directly at something, it's considered your subject. It's considered direct light. And if it's bouncing off of a surface, it can be bouncing. A beauty dish is actually an indirect light because the bulb bounces off two interior walls before projecting the light. So it is actually a soft light. Um, you can bounce it off of a wall. You can bounce it off of surfaces. Here I have an illustration at the bottom right. It's bouncing off of an adjacent building in through a window. So what you get is a difference of what we consider hard versus soft light. And in the middle, you can see the subject. One is lit sort of from the side behind by a hard sunlight, and she is getting some bounce light into her face from the building so that her shadows are not completely dark. Then the bottom image, you have she's sitting in a room, and the window is very close to her, so she has a very soft light on her face, and the interior of the room has some bounce, so she actually is very well illuminated, and with just a gentle gradation from left to right to give her face some volume. Okay. So this is, don't get scared away by this. This is just a little chart showing you some ways to understand how light works. In the first graph here, you have on one axis the relative intensity, and then on the second axis is how far you are away from that source of light. So if you imagine, I wonder if you can see my pointer. If you imagine a point R here, this is right at the light. Right at the light source is the brightest, right? And then the light is going to fall off very quickly. So the formula for this is intensity equals 1 over distance squared. So I don't know if you care, but basically what that means is it's called the inverse square law. And basically it just says light falls off very quickly at the beginning and then falls off slower the further away you get away from it. And here's another way to illustrate it and look at it. You can imagine light as an energy pulse coming out, and as it gets further away, it has to cover more area, so the intensity of it is diluted over that surface area. Okay, just another illustration to kind of show you how to think about light in a space, in an interior space, when you're next to, let's say, a large window that has a a sheer covering it, a light sheer covering it. So you have a big soft light source, and the closer you are to it, of course, you're going to be brighter. The way that I've expressed that is with the color there, how much of that light you're going to get. And then the further away you are from the light, you will be darker. I've put exposure values there they're not to scale, but the further away you get from the light, the darker you are, so the more overexposed your camera setting must be. And I think I put a slide here. Or did I say, don't worry, you're not going to be tested? Oh, no, not. There we go. Okay, so here's another way to sort of visualize it. As you move further away from the light, the intensity of the light gets less. But don't worry, okay, here it is. Don't worry, you won't be tested on this. This is just use the, right, okay. Don't worry, you won't be tested on this. Just use the auto feature that comes with every camera phone. Shoot it in RAW mode if you can. Hold that camera steady, or use a tripod if you need to. You'll be fine. Right, but it's fun to know what's going on, so you can use it to your advantage. Here's another example. I've taken those same cups and I've adjusted each one by a little bit their exposure value, so that they're sort of similarly exposed. But you can see that actually there's a difference in the shape of the shadows. So the transition between a dark shadow and the highlight we call feathering. So you can see that the closer you are to the light, the longer the feather distance is. I don't know if you can see that, but in the rightmost image, that image is closest to the light source, but it has the longest feather, meaning the longest transition from the bright color to the dark shadow. From the bright side of the cup to the dark side of the cup, it has a very gradual transition. And then when you come to being far away from the light, you have now a sharper transition. So we call this light a harder light, and we call the light that has a softer transition, we call that a softer light. But you also have to compensate for the intensity of the light, because when you're further away, you obviously need to expose your image so that it works out right. But again, don't worry, because the auto feature on your phone will take care of this. Okay, so I dug up some examples of a lady that I took photos of, and this all took place in the same day within a few hours of each other. So the first photo is her face is basically in shadow, and she's getting bounce light from the room. So that's what that looks like there. And the second picture is she's getting bounce light from an adjacent building through a window, but the window is frontal to her. Okay. And you can see that the background and her are equally illuminated, meaning there's she's getting the same amount of light as the background because she's actually leaning up against it. All right. Picture number 3, she is actually quite far away from the window, even though it's a floor to ceiling window. Because she's kind of far away, the transitions of her face are sharper. Okay, so looking at image number 4, now she has a skylight over her. It's not the ideal type of light for me because it does hide her eyes. In this type of picture, I tend to face her face upwards. So I would have her sit and face up. That way she can get more light into her eyes and less of a long shadow under her nose. Okay, image 5. Image 5, she is standing more or less in the shade under, I think, maybe a tree, so that the light hitting her is very dappled, and the background is actually a pool, and she's kind of facing her face up to the sky. So, and this way, she's kind of getting a blue light coming down on her face. And it's a very even light because it's basically the whole sky. Okay, the next one is number 6. And number 6, she is directly backlit by the sun, but her face is illuminated by an adjacent building. Number 7, again, she's in the sun, and I'm having her face her nose to the sun as much as possible. Of course, it causes her to squint. So it's not the ideal face position, but in order to avoid long shadows that aren't really pleasing on the face, you should have your subject point their nose to the sun if you can, but this is just to also demonstrate what kind of effects you get. Number 8, again, allowing her to point her face to the sun, but also shooting her from the side where I don't see as much shadow. But this type of technique works both indoors, outdoors, with subjects, and also with objects that you might be lighting, even in products. You can always use these principles. All right, so I want to show you the difference of an image and what exposure can do to it. So here's an image for a client, and generally people would just consider this a bad image. And if you were to ask them why, they they might say it's too dark, or they might say, oh, I don't know, I can't see anything, or I feel it doesn't look right. All right. And this is an image that is more or less properly exposed. It's not the final retouch, but it's the same image, but with the proper exposure. And so with very little, you can do a lot. Meaning, if you take a photo that's slightly dark, don't panic. It can be fixed. All right, again, here's another example. One of the things that I want to urge you guys is not to worry as much about light. Sometimes the light is just fine. In this office building, the light was just fine. I may have asked them to turn off the overheads, and so that I get more just window light. I often will do that. I will reduce the number of different lights because lights have different colors to them. But here's an image of just a couple of people working. I definitely arranged everything. This is a fake scene. And you can definitely just ask people to do this, and they're generally more than happy to, even though they'll always kind of make those funny remarks about how they don't look good or need to lose weight or so on and so forth. But, I think people generally are fairly willing to be photographed. But we did set it up with paperwork and with laptops and, putting the cords away and making sure that things are lined up actually a little bit to the edges of the table and stacked nicely, and people are wearing colors that don't clash. And also, the expressions, we kind of give them something to do so that they don't feel awkward. Sometimes I'll ask them to talk about their favorite fruits. All right, so here's that same photo, but I just exposed it, fixed the exposure. I also fixed the color a little bit, and I brightened the whole thing, and I brightened them specifically and darkened the background a little bit. And I also squeezed the picture from left to right a little bit, elongating the photo, and also making sure that the lines in the background are straight up and down. And I think that the same photo is now a lot more powerful. And so these are examples of what you can do to fix your photos and make them look more professional. Okay, here's an example of another one. Definitely staged. There was nowhere for the lady in green to sit. We had to bring over a stool. We definitely cleaned up her area just slightly, and draped the jacket over the chair. We had them interact, and we just gave them a subject to talk about. And here's that same photo fixed up slightly. Again, we elongated the photo. We corrected the color and made the subjects brighter. Okay, and I want to briefly talk about light and color and the different types of color you might get within a scene depending on where you are standing and where your camera is pointing. These are some of the things that you might want to be aware of when you're looking at an image and you're trying to evaluate what is right or wrong about the image. Sometimes the color matters. If it's a cloudy day, that's generally much better because you're not getting blue light. You're not getting blue light from the sky and a bright white light from the sun. But if you don't have a cloudy day, you generally will have a blue light coming towards the floor, and you're going to have whatever color light that is outside on the ground. If you have black asphalt, or if you have a brick building, or if you have a grassy lawn, or if you have some colorful bushes outside, you might get reflected color up towards the ceiling from that. If your neighbor has a very orange fence, and if the buildings outside are, generally whatever color they are, the light coming in directly from the side is generally a little bit more warm. So within one window, you're going to get 3 different color lights coming in. So the further away you are from the window, the more noticeable you'll see the different colors in the shadows. So that's just something to be aware of. You might have to color correct it afterwards, or you have to soften the light somehow, either putting a sheer over the window or something like that. Okay, so moving on to module 3.3, composition. So we're going to be talking about principles, priorities, focus, leading the eye. So this is like the design principles that you'll want to consider in composing your photos. Gestalt principle, repetition, leading lines, etc. Angles and perspectives, psychology behind it all. We'll talk about how to make your photos stand out as well. And we want to talk about how photos should be meeting marketing goals. Your brand messaging, if you don't have your brand messaging, you should be thinking about it. And if you do know your brand message, do your photos exhibit or express that brand message? Okay. We're going to make a separate video about that as well. All right. So just talking about some basic principles, and there's tons more words than this. I just picked out a few, and this is an exercise I used to make people do when they were applying to work at my company. Anyway, I would say, okay, you have three shapes: a circle, a square, and a rectangle, and show me as many different ways of filling a frame as possible. And you have 5 minutes to do it. And I would get all sorts of different results. And from that little test, it was, it would become pretty clear to me a couple of important things about the people that I was going to be hiring. Anyway, but this is also a good way to just show you the different ways that you can use composition to draw interest to something, or to to accomplish goals in your marketing. Okay. Uh, and a good marketing photo is basically one that creates some sort of response in the people viewing it, right? And so there is a purpose, there is a message, and there are ways and tools we can use that. These words, evoke these designs, these patterns, the way that we lead the subject to how we want them to see something. This is the power of photography. This is the power of design. So it's fun, and it's one of my favorite subjects. Okay, for example, just starting from the top left, we have contrast. So basically, contrast can be thought of as contrast in shape, contrast in shade, contrast in size. Here we have sort of a positive negative space use of contrast, pattern, uh, depth. So I've got one shape that is closer to us and the other shapes that are receding away. And generally, depth is characterized by things becoming more out of focus. Crop, if they were the same size, but the importance of it, the one shape that is completely within the crop has a certain amount of weight to it, a more importance, maybe. Symmetry, obviously. Asymmetry, you can draw attention to something using asymmetry. Hierarchy, placing something above others. Difference, you can have lots of objects and showing, highlighting the difference of something, maybe. Repetition, juxtaposition, contrast again, linear. Leading, this is a fun one. Leading, obviously. Focus, so just one shape at a time. Organic, making half circles, making fun shapes that feels organic out of the half circles. Chaotic, you can also have ordered, and so on and so forth. And so depending on the goals that you're trying to meet, sometimes the words that you would use to explain and to describe something, these words have a visual translation, and many people can kind of. Hi. Oh, are you on the call? I'm recording something. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Also, when's. Okay, where was I? Okay. Okay, so let's see here. What's next? All right. Of course, there are many other terms that have a visual component to them. So when you're thinking about the goals, it's important to write down feeling words and see if you can use the visual storytelling methods like this to get your point across even more effectively. Some general rules around framing when doing photography. One is the rule of thirds, putting the focus you want of the photo in one of the four corners of these converging lines here, or crossing lines. Okay, and you can choose any of the corners to put your subject in, but some work better than others. We can show you that later. So the rule of the golden whatever ratio, the golden ratio, right? So for me, this image nicely does it because you have a lot of information right here, and the information becomes larger and larger and larger. So this is a nicely framed photo. You have the converging lines of a single point perspective. So if you were to shoot an interior space, we often like to use this angle, the straight on single point perspective. All right. So for framing a subject, think about using these shapes and patterns when you're doing it. It's rather important because, for example, this windmill here, the size of the windmill in the frame, it's taking up a very large amount of space. It's taken up at least 6 of 9 squares, right? So the weight of it is big, and the weight of the trees are tiny, right? The trees are barely 1 square worth. So you can see that they're using scale here to tell a story, because the importance of something that we know to be much smaller, we know the windmill is much smaller than a big tree, maybe about the same size even, right? But the fact that you've pulled it so close and the trees are now very far away, and this creates a you know, a center point of importance. And if someone were to shoot this from their iPhone, they easily might be standing way too far back, and the trees would be of an equal size. Or maybe they're standing at the wrong angle and the trees are much larger than the windmill. Or perhaps they're shooting from atop a hill and the windmill looks small in comparison to the tree. So, in order to make this work, you have to be low enough, you have to be close enough, you have to use a wide enough angle on your lens. So these are all considerations that you must make when you're composing a photo. An effective use of the golden ratio here. This, I see this a lot. This is also based on a golden ratio, but this is a closer in, having objects closer in the middle. It's not the same as this wider tic-tac-toe grid. Having angularity, having one side of it be full of information and one side of it be having less information. So one side can be considered perhaps more chaotic than the other. This can also be considered asymmetrical. Center point, again, framing. Here's depth of field and framing. Using a nice use of space, of negative space on the side, and maybe foreground objects. This is taken from art, this blog here. So very good job they've done. Leading lines, repetition, linearity. This one is very dynamic here, taking up the full space, zooming in, change of scale. Here we have positive, negative space, but maybe a better crop would be tighter in. Same thing here. Because of symmetry, maybe you want to reduce your crop. Okay, talking about crop, here's an image that is properly cropped and one that is not properly cropped. And again, here's an image showing what coming in tight could do to an image. It goes from being less dynamic to very dynamic. Here's an example of cropping in without much concern, just centering the face. And here's the website that I got it from. Good crop, bad crop. Portraits. That's funny. Okay, and here's another look at how to crop. And you can see that the negative space above the top of her head is very much considered. The negative space that her body is creating is considered. Okay, so here's an interesting juxtaposition. I picked two photos and I put them side by side. I adjusted the size to change the importance. I wanted the weight of each one to be approximately the same. But you can see how an angle shooting up at a subject gives it more importance. But also you can see what size can do, and how by positioning the man lower down, I can change the importance of each subject. Of course, the little girl is already photographed in this very dignified way, but having an older man looking up at her and having the picture of the older man being smaller, this all plays into the psychology of this layout. Okay, here's another juxtaposition. Here's another juxtaposition. So I got one lady walking down the stairs and one lady sitting looking up slightly. Okay. And so the lady that's sitting down looking up slightly is older, and the lady who's walking down the stairs is younger. But the way that I have laid out, you can see that their sort of importance and weight feels different. We do feel like the younger lady somehow is more important, and somehow the lady sitting down is perhaps a little less important. When you have marketing goals, the design of a page really matters, and the way that you lead a person's eye on the page does matter. So these are some considerations to take into when you're making your photos. Again, looking down at someone makes them feel slightly less important and less. Actually, looking down at a subject makes them feel smaller and makes them feel younger, actually. So shooting down at an older lady is often helpful. And when you want to make a younger lady look more important, more dignified, or more older for their age, shooting up at them oftentimes is helpful. Here's another example of that. The age difference here is not a lot, but probably 10 years or so. And one lady is looking up and we're kind of looking up at her, and I have her standing, and the other lady is sitting down, more leaning forward, and you're looking down at her slightly. So these all play again into sort of the psychology of photography. I think, you can ask yourself, what are some of the adjectives that come to mind when you look at these photos, and what business purposes might they serve?